you struggling to choose between a MacBook and an iPad? Well, the choice is very simple. If you're rich, buy both. If you can only pick one, pick the MacBook. Always. The iPad is never necessary. So in this video, we're going to be picking between a variety of differences between the MacBook and the iPad. Things like the way it is to hold, battery life, performance, the kind of apps you get on there, and a lot more. So if you're picking between a MacBook and an iPad, that means that you value one thing, and that is portability. Because while desktop PCs are more powerful and have more features, you can't really take them anywhere. So of course, when it comes to picking between these two, you want something that is light and small and easy to use in a variety of situations, whether that be standing up or sitting down in a train or a plane, or when you're outside. So when it comes to this, the iPad is obviously the biggest winner. In fact, if you're looking just for portability, make sure to get the iPad mini, because my dad used to have an iPad mini, and because of how small that thing is, he was able to carry it around everywhere. You can fit it in glove boxes, you can put it in like small bags or satchel bags, and it'll fit perfectly. Meanwhile, the smallest MacBook you can buy right now that is new is the 13-inch MacBook Air, and the smallest thing you can fit that in is a backpack. So if you're going to be carrying around a laptop, you will always have to carry around a big bag on your back, while with the iPad, you can even just hold it in your hand if you aren't forgetful, or you can put it in like a handbag and all that stuff, which means that it's great for portability. If you've ever had to use a device while standing, you know how difficult it is to use a laptop. You have to have one hand sitting to act like a surface, while your other hand like awkwardly tries to use the trackpad, and typing is difficult because you can only use like one finger and slow. But with the iPad, you can easily hold that with one hand and still have a great time. You can hold it with two hands and have zero trouble using it while you're walking around. Like let's say you're walking on the treadmill, you can easily use an iPad during that situation. But what's the point of having a portable device if it's not powerful enough to run the apps that you need? When it comes to power, surprisingly, both devices are pretty equal. Both the MacBooks and the iPads, now almost all of them have Apple Silicon, which is very fast, and I'm using the MacBook Air M1. And even though it's only the very first Apple Silicon product, it's actually very powerful. I can run multiple windows, I can play games with high quality, all that kind of stuff. So imagine that same power, but in an iPad. I'm pretty sure that makes it one of the most powerful tablets in the world. So honestly, when it comes to performance, if you're going for the iPad Air and above, it will be just as powerful as a Mac. But of course, if you need even more power, like let's say you're doing graphically intensive stuff, then obviously the MacBook Pros are going to be the better performer. Okay, but what use is having all this power if the apps can't take advantage of it? Well, in that case, the answer is actually very simple. When it comes to the iPad, you're restricted to just the Apple App Store, and all the apps on there are designed to be very simple so that they can be easily used with just a touchscreen, just a few fingers. Meanwhile, with Mac, because they have professional users in mind, the apps can get pretty complex and will be able to do almost anything that you want. For example, I used to edit videos on my iPad, and this was before Final Cut Pro came out. So I was using LumaFusion, and while that video editor was great, it was very limited when it came to features. You could only have a maximum of like 6 tracks for video. So when it comes to making complex video projects, I usually had to find some fancy workarounds because the app just couldn't do what I wanted it to. Meanwhile, with my MacBook, I had Final Cut Pro, and that app basically has almost limitless possibilities. So anything I want to do when I'm editing videos, I can easily do with the MacBook. This isn't the only thing that is limited. When it comes to something like Microsoft Office, something that everyone uses, even my mom, who isn't really a computer expert, uses Microsoft Office. And if you notice, there's actually some differences between the Mac version and the iPad version. The Mac version has almost every feature that the Windows version has, but when you compare the MacBook version to the iPad version, there's a massive difference. The iPad version has only the most basic features, and something complex like mail merge is not available on the iPad version. In high school, I tried using the iPad as my only computer, and often I would run into issues because some of these apps just didn't have the features that were required to pass the classes. And that's a very important thing that you need to keep in mind. But if there's one place where the iPad beats the MacBook when it comes to apps, it has to be drawing, because unfortunately, there's no MacBook out there that comes with a stylus feature. So if you're looking to do handwriting or trying to do art, the only option that you have will be the iPad. But of course, if you're okay with trying Windows, then there are many Windows laptops that have stylus support, so you can get the best of both worlds. The apps I used to take notes was GoodNotes, so you could write notes in handwriting, and you could even convert it back to text. You almost get like the best of both worlds. You get the handwriting that you get like physical notes, but you get the benefits of digital in the sense that you can search all those handwritten text, which can can save you a lot of time when you're like writing notes or revising for a test. Right now with Apple, you're pretty much forced to buy both an iPad and a MacBook if you want like laptop features with the drawing. But with Windows, you just get everything combined into one computer. Now, one thing I wish more people would mention about the iPad is that, unfortunately, you cannot play two audio sources at the same time. So let's say you're editing a video, but you also want to listen to music in the background. You cannot do that. It won't allow you to. It'll pause the music every time you play the video. Every time you play the music, it stops the video. So it's kind of annoying. So if you're someone who likes to multitask like that, then make sure you get the MacBook instead. It's better. But the downside of Mac compared to Windows is that while Windows has an audio mixer, you don't get one on Mac. So make sure that the music or video app that you're using has its own like volume control. Otherwise, you can't control the separate volumes and it's kind of annoying. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Okay, now let's talk about typing. Sometimes you need to type big documents like, for example, a thesis, a research paper, that kind of stuff. Maybe you write blog articles. When it comes to typing, it depends on how rich you are. If you have lots of money to spend, then you can easily buy an iPad and then buy yourself the Magic Keyboard and boom, you got yourself a really nice typing setup that you can carry around with you everywhere. You can disconnect the keyboard and you still got all the tablet features. But if you're in a bit of a budget, you'll notice that buying the Magic Keyboard and the iPad ends up costing the same, if not more, than just buying a MacBook. So I think for most people, if you do lots of typing, the MacBook will be better. But if I'm being honest, I think the typing experience between the two devices should be more or less the same because you're pretty much using the same keyboard. If both keyboards are from Apple, then the typing experience should be very similar. In fact, the Magic Keyboard even has a trackpad. It's not like you're missing out on much. Now let's talk about gaming. Gaming, the iPad wins hands down. Get access to a bunch of free-to-play games, Asphalt, COD Mobile, Genshin Impact, so many other games as well. So if you love gaming, then this is like the perfect device to go for. Then if you look at Mac is really bad when it comes to games. Almost no games are available. However, Apple is starting to change this because now you're starting to get some AAA titles like, for example, Resident Evil is available now on MacBook. Maybe in the future, MacBook will be great for gaming. But right now, I honestly wouldn't recommend it. However, there is one upside, which is that emulation is possible on the MacBook. For example, I've played everything. I've played PSP games, I've played PS2 games, even a bit of PS3. And the MacBook M1, despite having no fans, can actually handle that very well. If you're looking for emulation, you'll be happy to know that the MacBook can handle that very well. But when it comes to the iPad, you can't really sideload apps, and emulators I don't think are allowed on the App Store. Now that Apple is going to allow sideloading in the EU, we might start to see more emulators make their way to the iPad. With lots of gaming comes lots of power consumption. How good is the battery life between the two devices? Surprisingly, I'd say both are equal. So I use the MacBook Air M1 and the iPad 7th generation. With my MacBook, I get about 10 hours of usage when it comes to doing productivity-based stuff like web browsing or using Microsoft Word, all that kind of stuff. Then I think with heavy gaming, I get anywhere from like 2 to 4 hours, which is still much better than Windows laptops. Then when it comes to the iPad, my battery life ranged usually somewhere from 7 to 10 hours when it came to web browsing and note-taking and accessing like Microsoft Office. Then when it came to gaming, battery life was between 2 and 3 hours. With both devices, you'll be very satisfied with the battery life and you don't really need to carry a charger around. Then let's talk about speakers. When it comes to speakers, both devices are just as good. You won't be disappointed with either. Then let's talk about screens. The more expensive the product, the better the screen. But I'd say if you're going for the cheapest Apple products, let's say the base level iPad and the base level MacBook both have really good screens, you won't be disappointed. And when you go up to the more expensive models where you have like, what's it called, micro LED, the displays look really good. And I think you won't feel like you're missing out on anything. When it comes to screens and speakers, I would say they're both equal. But when it comes to screen size, of course, the smallest screen you can get will be with the iPad. The biggest screen you can get will be with the MacBooks. So if you want a big screen, get the MacBook Pro 16-inch. If you want the smallest thing, get the iPad mini. The reason why you want a big screen, because you want to be a productive person. Usually that involves some form of multitasking. For example, let's say you're writing a research paper. You probably have to have a Google Chrome open on one side, and on the other side you'd have your notes with all your research and your sources and all that stuff. And I'd say when it comes to multitasking, it depends on how often you need to do it. So if you're not someone who multitasks often, the iPads will be fine. Even my older iPad 7th generation is capable of split screen. You can even put a third app in the slide over window if you're doing like a lot of stuff at once. It's actually pretty decent. But of course, if you go for the iPad Air and the iPad Pro, which have the Apple Silicon, you can actually act as Stage Manager, which basically gives you a desktop very similar to what you have on Mac. And I've heard it's pretty good, but I haven't tried it myself. if you're the type of person to have multiple apps open and to never close apps when you're done with them, then MacBook will be better. For example, I'll be editing a video, but then I'll still have Google Chrome open in the background. If, for example, I need to search for a tutorial or I need to download photos, the MacBook is great because it always keeps like a bunch of apps open at the same time. It's easy to switch between them compared to the iPad, which is a bit more limited in that sense. So if you're like a power user, someone who uses all the features, get the MacBook, but all you do is like basic stuff like watching YouTube videos or browsing social media, then the iPad will always be the better choice. So light tasks, iPad; heavy tasks, MacBook. Okay, but now let's say you want to connect devices, USB drives or microphone. Now that the iPad has USB-C, the playing field is almost level. So if, for example, you plug in a microphone like this, or you occasionally plug in a flash drive, the iPad can actually do those things fine. If you're someone who shares files between a Apple product and, let's say, a Windows computer, you'll find there's one problem. iPads and MacBooks do not support NTFS, which is a file system used by Windows. That means that if you plug in a flash drive that was formatted in NTFS, you can't actually move or delete files in the flash drive, which is really unfortunate. So for example, my situation, I was recording videos or clips onto a flash drive on my Xbox, and every time I plugged it into my iPad, while I could copy and view files, I couldn't actually delete files off the flash drive. So anytime the flash drive got full of recordings, I'd always have to find a Windows computer, plug it in, and then delete the files from there, which is really annoying. But with MacBook, you also don't have NTFS support. However, you have the ability to download software that allows you to do that. For example, right now, I'm using this one called Tuxera NTFS. So now I can actually move and delete files off of NTFS hard drives. Now you might think this isn't a big issue, but like if you're constantly transferring files between devices, this is a big deal. So if I were you, I'd either go for the MacBook or just go for a Windows computer, just outright in that scenario. But of course, with the iPad having USB-C, that means that if you have Type-C dongles, let's say you want to plug in a dongle to a screen mirror to a television, both devices can do that, which is good. And both devices will also interact with USB devices. So if you occasionally plug stuff in, the iPad is fine. But honestly, if you always plug stuff into your computer, the MacBook will always be the better choice. So if I were you, make sure you have a laptop. It doesn't have to be an Apple one, just have a laptop in general. Then you can get an iPad. But if you're going to buy both, just make sure both are Apple, because there's actually some really cool features that you can use between MacBook and iPad. For example, you can actually use your iPad as a second monitor for your MacBook, which is actually pretty cool. So if you want to learn more about that, click on this video on the screen.